He thought I was weak, that no one would ever stand up for me. The moment his hand rose, my world almost shattered. But then the door opened. One step changed everything. One man walked in, and suddenly, the one who tried to break me realized he had made the biggest mistake of his life. What happened next didn't just stop him, it destroyed everything he thought he controlled. I used to believe that my marriage was built on something solid, something unbreakable. In the beginning, everything felt easy and natural, like we understood each other without trying too hard. We laughed often, shared small dreams, and talked about a future that seemed simple and happy. Even when life got stressful, I told myself that every couple goes through difficult moments, and that love was about staying together through all of it. I trusted him completely, and I never imagined that fear would one day replace that trust. Over time, though, small changes began to appear. They were so subtle that I almost ignored them. His tone would shift during conversations, becoming sharper, more impatient. He would get irritated over things that never seemed to matter before. At first, I thought it was just stress from work or outside pressure. I kept making excuses for him, convincing myself that things would go back to normal soon. I didn't want to believe that something deeper was wrong, so I chose to stay quiet and hopeful. Disclaimer. This is a fictional story created for entertainment and educational purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or situations is purely coincidental and not intended. That night started like any other evening, but there was a strange heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. It felt like something was waiting to happen, like the calm before a storm. We sat in the same room, but the silence between us felt louder than any argument we had ever had. I tried to start a normal conversation, hoping to break the tension, but his responses were short and cold. Each word he spoke felt distant, like he was no longer the person I once knew. As the minutes passed, the tension began to grow. I could feel my heartbeat getting faster, even though nothing had happened yet. There was a look in his eyes that I had never seen before, something unfamiliar and unsettling. It made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't describe. I wanted to leave the room, to step away and give us both space, but something held me there. Maybe it was confusion, or maybe it was the hope that things would calm down if I stayed. Then the argument began, suddenly and without warning. One small comment turned into something bigger, and before I knew it, we were raising our voices. It wasn't the kind of argument we used to have. This felt different, more intense, more personal. His words were no longer just expressions of frustration, they felt like attacks. Each sentence carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I tried to respond calmly at first, trying to bring things back under control, but it was like talking to someone who wasn't listening at all. The more I tried to explain myself, the angrier he seemed to become. His voice grew louder, filling the room in a way that made it hard to breathe. I could feel the space around me shrinking, as if the walls were closing in. My thoughts became scattered, and I struggled to find the right words. I didn't recognize this version of him, and that realization scared me more than anything else. It was like watching a stranger slowly replace the person I loved. I took a step back, hoping that creating distance would calm him down, but it didn't work. Instead, it seemed to make things worse. His movements became more aggressive, more unpredictable. I could see the anger building inside him, growing stronger with each passing second. It was no longer just an argument. It was something else, something dangerous. For the first time, I felt a deep sense of fear that I couldn't ignore. My mind raced with questions. How did we get here? When did things change so much? I tried to hold on to the memories of who he used to be, hoping that person was still there somewhere. But the man standing in front of me didn't look like him anymore. His face was tense, his eyes filled with a kind of anger that felt out of control. I realized then that I couldn't predict what he might do next, and that uncertainty made everything worse. I wanted to say something, anything, to stop what was happening. But the words wouldn't come out. My voice felt stuck, trapped by the fear that had taken over. All I could do was stand there, watching, waiting, hoping that the moment would pass without getting worse. The silence between his words felt heavier than before, filled with tension that seemed ready to explode at any second. In that moment, everything I believed about my life felt like it was slipping away. The comfort, the safety, the trust, all of it felt fragile and uncertain. I realized that I had been ignoring the signs for too long, convincing myself that things were fine when they weren't. And now, standing there, I couldn't escape the truth anymore. Something had changed, and there was no going back to the way things used to be. The argument had already pushed me to the edge, but what happened next felt unreal. Like time itself suddenly slowed down. His face twisted with anger, his eyes locked onto mine with a look I had never seen before. It wasn't just frustration anymore, it was something darker. Something that made my chest tighten. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears, loud and uneven, as if my body was warning me before my mind could fully understand what was happening. Then his arm moved. Slowly at first, almost as if he was hesitating. But the intention was clear. His hand rose into the air, and in that instant, everything around me seemed to freeze. The room, the walls, even the faint sounds from outside, all of it, faded into nothing. There was only that one moment, stretched endlessly, where I realized what he was about to do. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt completely powerless, unable to react or even step away. I had never imagined this would happen to me. We had argued before, raised our voices, said things we didn't mean, but this was different. This crossed a line I didn't even think existed between us. My mind struggled to process it, trying to find some explanation, some reason that would make it less real. But there was none. The truth stood right in front of me, impossible to ignore. The man I trusted was about to hurt me. My body refused to move. It was as if fear had rooted me to the spot, holding me in place. I wanted to step back, to protect myself, but I couldn't. My hands felt cold, my fingers trembling slightly, but even that small movement felt distant, like it wasn't really happening to me. I could see his hand getting closer, the space between us shrinking with each passing second. Every detail became sharper: the tension in his arm, the anger in his expression, the silence that filled the room. In that stretched moment, memories flashed through my mind without warning. The early days of our relationship, the laughter, the promises we had made to each other, they all felt so far away now, like they belonged to a different life. I wondered how something that once felt so safe could turn into this. How did we go from love to fear in a way that felt so sudden, yet so inevitable? I tried to speak, to say something that might stop him, but my voice wouldn't come out. It felt trapped inside me, buried under the weight of shock and disbelief. My lips parted slightly, but no sound followed. It was as if my entire body had shut down, unable to respond to the danger right in front of me. I had never felt so exposed, so defenseless, standing there with no control over what was about to happen. His hand was close now. Too close. I could almost feel the air shift with its movement. The tension in the room reached a point where it felt like it might break at any second. My mind screamed at me to react, to do something, but nothing changed. I was stuck in that moment, caught between what had been and what was about to happen. And then, just as everything seemed lost, something unexpected broke through the silence. The sound of the door opening cut sharply through the tension, loud and sudden. It was so unexpected that it felt almost unreal, like a sudden interruption in a nightmare. Both of us froze, the movement stopping instantly as the moment shattered around us. I turned my head slightly, my heart still racing, trying to understand what had just happened. The shift was immediate, like the entire energy in the room had changed in an instant. The anger that had filled the space just seconds ago seemed to pull back, replaced by something else, something uncertain. I could feel it without even fully seeing it yet. His hand slowly lowered, no longer frozen in that threatening position. The intensity in his face changed, replaced by a flicker of hesitation. It was as if whatever had just entered the room had broken his control, interrupting the path he had been so close to crossing. I didn't fully understand it yet, but I knew that something important had just happened. I stood there, still trying to catch my breath, my mind struggling to keep up with the sudden shift. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer about what he might do next. It was about what had just stopped him. And what would happen now? The moment that had felt endless was suddenly over, but its impact remained, lingering in the air like an echo that refused to fade. The sound of the door opening didn't just interrupt the moment, it completely changed it. The sharp noise cut through the tension like a blade, pulling both of us out of that frozen second. My husband's hand stopped midair, his body stiffening as if he had been caught doing something he couldn't explain. I turned toward the doorway, my breath uneven, my heart still racing from what had almost happened. And there he was, my father standing quietly at the entrance, his presence filling the room in a way I had never felt before. He didn't rush inside or raise his voice. He simply stood there, observing. His posture was calm, almost too calm for the situation. But his eyes were different. They moved from me to my husband in a slow, measured way, taking in everything without needing a single word. It was a look I had rarely seen growing up, one that carried weight and authority without any need for explanation. In that moment, I realized that his silence was more powerful than any reaction he could have shown. My husband slowly lowered his hand, stepping back as if the space between them suddenly mattered. The confidence he had just seconds ago seemed to fade, replaced by a hesitation that hadn't been there before. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. The shift in his body language, the way his shoulders dropped slightly, the way his eyes avoided direct contact. It was as if he had recognized something about my father that I hadn't fully understood yet. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The room was completely silent, but it wasn't the same silence from before. This one felt controlled, almost deliberate, like every second was being carefully measured. I stood there, caught between relief and confusion, trying to understand what had just happened. My father's presence had stopped everything instantly, but I didn't know why it had such a strong effect. He finally stepped forward, closing the distance slowly. Each step was steady, confident, and purposeful. He didn't look at me again. His focus remained on my husband. It wasn't an aggressive stare, but it wasn't friendly either. It was something in between, something that carried a quiet warning. I had seen my father handle difficult situations before, but never like this. There was no emotion on his face, no visible anger, and yet the atmosphere in the room felt heavier than ever. My husband tried to speak, but the words didn't come out clearly. He stumbled over them, as if unsure of what to say or how to say it. It was a complete contrast to the way he had been acting just moments ago. The anger that had filled his voice was gone, replaced by uncertainty. I could see him trying to regain control of the situation, but it wasn't working. Something about my father's presence made that impossible. My father raised his hand slightly, not in anger, but in a simple gesture to stop him from speaking. The movement was small, almost casual, but it carried enough authority to silence him instantly. That alone surprised me. I had never seen anyone stop my husband so easily without even raising their voice. It made me realize that there was a side of my father I didn't fully know, a side that didn't need to prove itself loudly. When my father finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady. There was no anger in it, no raised tone, just a quiet firmness that demanded attention. He said only a few words, but they were enough to shift the entire situation. He didn't ask questions or make accusations. Instead, he made it clear that what had just happened was unacceptable, without needing to describe it in detail. His words were simple, but the meaning behind them was impossible to ignore. My husband nodded slightly, avoiding direct eye contact. It was clear that he understood the message, even if nothing had been explained fully. The tension in the room changed again, moving away from immediate danger and into something more controlled, more deliberate. It felt like the situation had moved into a different stage, one where emotions were no longer driving the moment. I stood there, still trying to process everything. Relief washed over me in waves, but it was mixed with something else, something deeper. I realized how close things had come to crossing a line that couldn't be undone. And yet, at the same time, I couldn't ignore the way my father had handled it. There was a sense of authority in him that I had never truly noticed before, a quiet strength that didn't need to be explained. The room no longer felt like the same place it had been just minutes ago. The fear that had filled it had been replaced by a different kind of tension, one that felt more controlled but no less serious. My father's presence had changed everything, not through force or anger, but through something far more powerful, something that made it clear that the situation was no longer out of control, even if nothing had been resolved yet. That night didn't end with shouting or chaos. Instead, it ended with a quiet tension that stayed in the air long after the moment had passed. My father didn't stay long. After a brief, controlled exchange, he told me he would speak to me later, and then left as calmly as he had arrived. My husband barely said a word after that. He avoided looking at me, moving around the house like a stranger, as if he didn't know how to act anymore. I stayed silent too, but my mind refused to rest. There was something I didn't understand, something bigger than what had just happened. When I was younger, my father had always been a simple man in my eyes. He worked, came home, and kept to himself. He never spoke much about his past, and I never asked. It wasn't something I thought about deeply. To me, he was just my father, quiet, protective in his own way, but never someone I would associate with fear or power. That night, though, something about him felt different. The way my husband reacted, the way the entire situation shifted the moment he walked in it, didn't feel normal. The next morning, I woke up with the same heavy feeling in my chest. My husband had already left the house without saying anything. There was no apology, no conversation, nothing. It felt like he was avoiding something, or maybe someone. I sat alone, replaying everything in my mind, trying to understand the change I had witnessed. The image of my father standing in that doorway stayed with me. Calm, silent, yet somehow in complete control of the situation. Later that day, my father called me and asked me to come see him. His voice was steady, just like it had been the night before. There was no urgency, but there was something in his tone that told me this conversation mattered. When I arrived, he was sitting in his usual place, as if nothing unusual had happened. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined everything, that maybe I had misunderstood the situation. But when he looked at me, I knew that wasn't true. His expression was serious, more serious than I had ever seen before. He didn't waste time with small talk. Instead, he asked me a simple question: whether this was the first time something like that had happened. I hesitated before answering, not because I didn't know the truth, but because saying it out loud made it real. I admitted that it wasn't the first time I had seen signs of anger, but it was the first time it had gone that far. He listened carefully without interrupting. There was no immediate reaction, no visible anger, just quiet attention. When I finished, he leaned back slightly, taking a moment before speaking. What he said next changed the way I saw him completely. He told me that there were things about his life I didn't know, things he had kept hidden to protect me from a world I didn't need to be part of. His words were calm, but they carried a weight that made it clear this wasn't something small. He began to explain that his past wasn't as simple as I believed. Before the life I knew, he had been involved in situations that required strength, influence, and connections most people never encounter. He didn't go into every detail, but he made it clear that he had built relationships with people who operated in powerful circles. Some of those connections, he said, still existed. They weren't something he used often, but they were always there. As I listened, I felt a mix of shock and confusion. It was hard to connect the man sitting in front of me with the image he was describing. He had always been so quiet, so reserved. I had never seen any sign of this other side of him. And yet, everything he said started to make sense when I thought about the way my husband had reacted. It wasn't just fear of being caught. It was something deeper, something that came from recognizing who my father truly was. My father made it clear that he had chosen to live a quieter life for my sake. He didn't want me to grow up surrounded by the kind of world he had known. He wanted me to have something normal, something peaceful. That was why he never spoke about it. never showed that side of himself. But now, he said, things had changed. The moment he saw what had happened, he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. I sat there trying to process everything. The man I thought I knew felt like a stranger in some ways. Yet, at the same time, I could see the same care and protection he had always shown me. It just had a different form now. One I had never needed to understand before. The calmness he carried wasn't just part of his personality. It was something built from experience, from a past that had shaped him into someone far more powerful than I had realized. He looked at me carefully and told me that I didn't need to be afraid anymore. Not of my husband, not of what might happen next. There was a certainty in his voice that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't a promise made out of emotion. It was something stronger, something grounded in competence and control. For the first time since that night, I felt a small sense of relief, knowing that I wasn't facing the situation alone. When my father returned to the house that evening, the atmosphere shifted again, but this time it wasn't sudden or shocking. It was controlled, steady, almost calculated. My husband was already home, sitting in the living room in an unusual silence. He looked up the moment my father entered, and I noticed the tension in his posture immediately. It was subtle, but it was there. The stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hands rested too still, as if he was trying not to reveal anything. My father didn't greet him the way most people would. There were no polite smiles or casual words. He simply stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and stood there for a brief moment, observing. It wasn't uncomfortable silence, it was deliberate. He was taking in the environment, reading the room in a way that made everything feel more serious than it already was. I stood slightly to the side, unsure of where I fit into this moment, but unable to look away. Then, in that same calm voice I had heard before, my father spoke. "We need to talk." The words were simple, almost ordinary, but the way he said them carried a weight that made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a decision already made. My husband hesitated for a second, as if considering his response, but in the end he nodded. There was no argument, no resistance, just quiet agreement. They moved into the next room together, leaving me alone in the living area. The door didn't close completely, but it was enough to separate their conversation from where I stood. I could hear faint movements, the shifting of chairs, but no clear words. The silence that followed was even harder to handle than the argument from before. At least then, I knew what was happening. Now, I was left with nothing but my thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. I tried to distract myself, walking slowly across the room, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting, just to keep my hands busy. But my mind refused to focus on anything else. Every small sound from the other room made my heart jump slightly. I wondered what my father was saying, how he was handling the situation. Part of me expected anger, confrontation, something loud and intense. But based on what I had already seen, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Minutes passed, though it felt much longer. The air in the house felt thick, almost difficult to breathe. I realized that this wasn't just a conversation. It was something more controlled, more precise. My father wasn't reacting emotionally. He was addressing the situation in a way that was deliberate and measured. That thought alone made me both nervous and curious. I didn't know exactly what he was capable of, but I was beginning to understand that it went far beyond what I had ever imagined. At one point, I thought I heard my husband's voice, quieter than usual, almost uncertain. It was a tone I had never heard from him before. He had always been confident, sometimes overly so, especially during arguments. But now, there was something different in the way he spoke. Even though I couldn't make out the words, I could feel the change in his attitude. It was subtle, but it was there. I found myself standing closer to the door without even realizing it, as if being physically nearer would help me understand what was happening inside. But the voices remained low, controlled, impossible to fully hear. It felt intentional, like whatever was being said wasn't meant for me to catch every detail. That only made my imagination work harder, filling in the gaps with possibilities that made my chest tighten. Time seemed to stretch again, much like it had the night before, but in a different way. This wasn't a moment of sudden danger. It was a slow, steady build of something I couldn't quite define. I realized that my father wasn't trying to create fear through loud words or aggressive actions. He was doing something else entirely. Something that worked beneath the surface. Something that didn't need to be seen to be effective. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably much less, I heard movement again. Chairs shifting, footsteps approaching the door. I quickly stepped back, not wanting to appear like I had been listening, even though I hadn't heard much. The door opened, and both of them walked out into the living room. The difference in my husband was immediate and impossible to ignore. His face looked pale, his expression uncertain. The confidence he once carried was gone, replaced by something much quieter. Something almost fragile. He avoided looking directly at me, focusing instead on anything else in the room. It was as if he didn't trust himself to meet my eyes. My father, on the other hand, looked exactly the same as before. Calm, composed, and completely in control. There was no visible sign of what had just been discussed. No hint of emotion on his face. If someone had walked in at that moment, they might not have realized anything serious had happened. But I knew better. The shift in the atmosphere, the change in my husband's behavior, it all pointed to something significant. My father glanced at me briefly, his expression softening just slightly, before returning his attention to my husband. There was no need for further words in that moment. Whatever had been said in that room had already done its work. The tension was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer chaotic or unpredictable. It was controlled, contained, and waiting for what would come next. When the door closed behind them, it felt like the entire house went quiet in a way I'd never experienced before. It wasn't the kind of silence that brings peace. It was heavy, filled with tension and unanswered questions. I stood in the living room, staring at the door as if it might suddenly reveal what was happening inside. My hands felt cold, and I realized I was holding my breath without even noticing. I slowly exhaled, trying to calm myself. But the uneasiness didn't go away. I moved closer to the door without thinking, my steps careful and quiet. It wasn't that I wanted to listen in on their conversation, but I couldn't ignore the need to understand what was unfolding. I paused just a few steps away, hoping to catch even a single word. But there was almost nothing. Just faint, muffled sounds, voices kept low, controlled, impossible to make out clearly. That silence spoke louder than any argument could have. I stepped back, feeling a strange mix of frustration and fear. My mind immediately started filling in the gaps. I imagined my father speaking in that same calm tone, choosing his words carefully, each one carrying more weight than it seemed. I imagined my husband sitting across from him, trying to maintain his confidence, but slowly realizing that he was no longer in control. The thought of that shift, of that quiet power, made my chest tighten again. Time began to stretch in a way that felt almost unreal. Every second passed slowly, dragging with it a growing sense of tension. I tried to distract myself by pacing around the room, picking up small things and putting them back down without thinking. Nothing could hold my attention for more than a moment. My focus kept returning to that closed door, to the conversation I couldn't hear but could somehow feel. At one point, I thought I heard my father's voice, low and steady. It wasn't loud enough to understand, but there was a rhythm to it, a calm certainty that didn't waver. There were no sharp tones, no raised voices, just something firm and controlled. It was completely different from the way my husband had sounded earlier. The contrast between those two energies made everything feel even more intense. Then there was a pause, longer than the others. The silence deepened, almost pressing against me. I found myself standing still, listening carefully, as if something important was about to happen. I wondered what that pause meant. Was my husband trying to respond? Was he struggling to find the right words? Or was he simply realizing that there was nothing he could say to change the situation anymore? A faint sound followed, like a chair shifting slightly. Then another low voice, this time softer, less certain. I recognized it as my husband's, but it didn't sound like him. The confidence that once filled his voice was gone. In its place was hesitation, uncertainty, something that felt almost unfamiliar. Even without hearing the words, I could tell that something inside that room had changed. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The situation felt bigger than I had expected, more serious than a simple confrontation. My father wasn't reacting emotionally, he was doing something else, something more controlled and deliberate. It felt like he was setting something in motion, something that would have consequences beyond this moment. The minutes continued to pass, each one adding to the weight in the air. I started to realize that this wasn't just about what had happened the night before. This was about something deeper, something that needed to be addressed properly. My father wasn't just stopping a moment of anger, he was making sure it would never happen again. That thought brought a strange sense of comfort, but it also made me nervous about what that might involve. I tried to sit down, but I couldn't stay still. My legs felt restless, my thoughts moving too quickly to settle. I stood up again, walking slowly across the room, then back again, as if movement could somehow release the tension building inside me. But nothing changed. The house remained quiet, the conversation hidden behind that closed door. At one point, I realized how unusual it was that I couldn't hear more. In most situations, raised voices would carry through the walls, revealing at least parts of the argument. But here, there was none of that. Everything was controlled, contained. It made me think that whatever my father was saying didn't need volume to be effective. His words alone, spoken calmly, were enough. Finally, after what felt like an endless wait, I heard movement again. Footsteps approached the door, steady and deliberate. My heart started racing again, faster than before. I instinctively stepped away, not wanting to appear like I had been standing there the whole time. I turned slightly, trying to look composed, even though I felt anything but calm. The door opened, and both of them stepped out. The shift was immediate, almost striking. My husband looked different, his face pale, his posture slightly lowered, as if something had been taken from him. He avoided my eyes, focusing on the floor for a brief moment before looking away entirely. It was a version of him I had never seen before, and it made me realize just how much had changed in that short period. My father, on the other hand, looked exactly the same, calm, steady, and unreadable. There was no sign of what had just taken place, no visible emotion, nothing to suggest that anything intense had happened behind that door. But the contrast between the two of them said everything that needed to be said. Whatever had been discussed in that private conversation had shifted the balance completely, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. When they walked out of the room, the change in atmosphere was immediate and impossible to ignore. It was as if the air itself had shifted. My husband was the first to step out, and the moment I saw his face, I knew something had changed inside him. The confidence he usually carried, even after arguments or tension, was gone. His eyes looked down, avoiding both me and my father, as if direct contact would reveal something he didn't want exposed. My father followed right behind him, moving at the same calm pace as the four. There was nothing unusual in his expression, no sign of what had just happened inside that room. That was what made it even more unsettling. If I had not been waiting there, I might have assumed nothing serious had taken place at all. But I could feel it. Something had shifted, not through words or actions I could clearly point to, but through the energy between them. My husband stood near the center of the room, unsure of where to place himself. It was the first time I had seen him look uncertain in such a visible way. Usually, even during disagreements, he tried to maintain control of the situation to keep his confidence intact. But now, that control was gone. His hands moved slightly, then stopped, as if he was unsure whether to speak or remain silent. My father didn't immediately say anything. He simply looked at him for a moment, calm and steady. It wasn't a stare meant to intimidate, but it carried weight nonetheless. It was the kind of silence that didn't need explanation. My husband seemed to understand it, because he nodded slightly, almost automatically, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided inside that room. I stood to the side, watching carefully, trying to understand what had just taken place. There was no argument happening now. No raised voices, no visible conflict. Instead, there was something else. a kind of silent understanding that I couldn't fully interpret yet. It felt like a decision had been made, not through force, but through something quieter and more permanent. My husband finally spoke, but his voice was different. It was lower, more controlled, and lacked the usual sharpness it carried during disagreements. He didn't look at me while speaking. Instead, his words were directed generally into the space between us, as if he wasn't fully sure who he was addressing. It was a short sentence, something about needing time or space, but even that small statement felt heavy. My father gave a slight nod in response, not approving or disapproving, but acknowledging. It was clear that whatever had been said inside that room had already set boundaries that didn't need to be repeated. There was no need for further discussion in that moment. Everything had already been communicated in a way that went beyond words. My husband moved slowly toward the side of the room, sitting down without really looking at anyone. His posture was different now, less rigid, more withdrawn. It wasn't defeat exactly, but it wasn't confidence either. It was something in between, something uncertain. I had never seen him like that before, and it made me uneasy in a way I couldn't fully explain. My father finally turned toward me. His expression softened slightly, just enough to break the strict formality of the moment. He didn't ask me anything immediately. Instead, he seemed to check whether I was okay, whether I understood what had just happened, even without full details being shared. I nodded slightly, though I wasn't completely sure what I was agreeing to. There was a long pause after that, one that felt less tense than before but still deeply serious. My father finally spoke again, this time addressing both of us in a calm, measured tone. He didn't repeat what had been said inside the room. Instead, he made a simple statement about respect and boundaries. His words were not emotional, but they carried a finality that made them impossible to ignore. My husband listened without interrupting. For the first time, he didn't try to respond immediately or defend himself. He simply listened, as if understanding that this was not a conversation meant for debate. I could see it in the way he sat, the way his shoulders remained slightly lowered, that something inside him had already accepted the direction of things. I found myself standing still, observing both of them carefully. The situation no longer felt like a confrontation. It felt more like a reset, though not one that had erased what had happened. Instead, it felt like a boundary had been drawn, clearly and firmly, without needing force or aggression. That realization made everything feel even more serious. My father eventually stepped back slightly, signaling that the immediate moment had ended. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a quiet sense that the discussion was over for now. My husband remained seated for a few seconds longer, then slowly stood up again, still avoiding eye contact. The room settled into a different kind of silence, one that was no longer chaotic but still heavy with meaning. I stood between them, aware that nothing would feel the same after this moment, even if nothing else was said right away. Later that night, after everything had quieted down, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt filled with unanswered questions, like something had been revealed, but not fully explained. My husband stayed distant, barely speaking, and my father left after a short while without giving any further details. I was left alone with my thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since that moment in the doorway. The next day, I decided to meet my father again. I needed clarity, not assumptions. When I reached his place, he was already waiting. It felt like he had expected me, like he knew I would come with questions. He didn't ask me anything at first. He simply gestured for me to sit, and I could tell from his expression that this conversation would be different from the previous ones. There was no urgency in his movements, only calm control. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. I struggled to find the right way to begin. But before I could say anything, he spoke first. His voice was steady, but more serious than usual. He told me that what I had witnessed was only a small part of a much larger truth. That sentence alone made my stomach tighten. I realized then that the situation wasn't as simple as I had believed. He leaned back slightly and began to explain, carefully choosing his words. He said that life before I was born had taken him through places and situations I could not imagine. He wasn't speaking in a dramatic way, but rather in a factual tone, as if he was describing something ordinary to him. He said there were decisions he had made in the past that had connected him to people and networks that still existed in the background of his life. As I listened, I found it difficult to connect this version of him with the quiet, reserved father I had always known. He continued, saying that he had deliberately chosen to step away from that world when I was young. He wanted a peaceful life, far from the kind of environment he had once been part of. That was why I had never heard about it, never seen it, never even suspected it. I asked him directly what that had to do with what happened in my house. He paused for a moment before answering, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then he told me that the way my husband had acted had crossed a boundary he could not ignore. It wasn't just about anger or disrespect. It was about something deeper, something that connected to the way people understood consequences in the world he had once been part of. He didn't give unnecessary details, but he made it clear that the response I had seen was not random. It was controlled and deliberate. He said that when he walked into that room, he wasn't reacting emotionally. He was observing, assessing, and deciding how to handle a situation that could not be left unresolved. His calmness, he explained, came from experience, not indifference. I sat there quietly, trying to process everything. The idea that my father had a past like that was difficult to accept. But at the same time, it explained things I couldn't previously understand. The way my husband had reacted, the shift in his behavior, the sudden loss of confidence, it all pointed to something deeper than a simple confrontation. My father then said something that stayed with me. He told me that strength doesn't always show itself through aggression or loud actions. Sometimes it appears in silence, in control, in the ability to influence a situation without needing to escalate it. He said that what happened in that room wasn't about fear alone, but about clarity, making sure that something would not repeat itself again. I asked him if he regretted stepping into the situation. He looked at me for a moment before answering. He said no, without hesitation. Then he added that his only concern was ensuring my safety and peace of mind. That was all he ever wanted, regardless of the methods required to achieve it. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made them hard to dismiss. I left his place that day with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of understanding. The image I had of him had changed, but not in a way that removed who he was to me. Instead, it revealed parts of him I had never needed to see before. On the way back home, I kept replaying his words, trying to connect them with everything I had experienced recently. When I returned, my husband was still distant, but calmer than before. He didn't ask where I had been, and I didn't immediately tell him. There was a silence between us that felt different now. It wasn't just tension anymore. It felt like something had been acknowledged, something that had shifted permanently in the background of our lives. The next morning, after my conversation with my father, I woke up with a strange heaviness in my chest. Nothing had physically changed around me, but everything felt different. My husband was still in the house, but the distance between us had grown even more noticeable. He didn't speak much, avoided unnecessary contact, and moved around like someone trying not to disturb an invisible line that had been drawn. I kept watching him quietly, trying to understand what was going on in his mind after what had happened. Around midday, my father called again. His voice was calm as usual, but there was a seriousness in it that made me sit up straight immediately. He asked me to come over, not urgently, but firmly enough that I knew it wasn't optional. I didn't argue. I went without delay, already sensing that this conversation would be different from the last one. When I arrived, he was waiting in the same place, composed and steady, as if he had been thinking about this moment for a long time. He didn't start with explanations this time. Instead, he looked at me carefully and asked if I was emotionally prepared to hear something direct. That question itself made my stomach tighten. I nodded, even though I wasn't fully sure what that meant. He took a slow breath and began speaking in a controlled tone, telling me that the situation involving my husband had reached a point where silence was no longer an option. He explained that during his assessment of my husband, he had discovered patterns that were concerning. It wasn't just about anger or behavior in isolated moments. It was about consistent actions, financial decisions, and connections that didn't align with what I had been told. He didn't go into unnecessary detail, but what he did say was enough to make me realize that he had been observing quietly for longer than I had known. Then he paused and looked directly at me. His next words were careful but firm. He said that continuing on the current path without addressing the underlying issues would only lead to deeper problems later. He didn't raise his voice, but the seriousness in his tone made it clear that he was no longer speaking as a distant observer. He was now fully involved in the situation. I asked him what exactly he intended to do. That was when the atmosphere shifted slightly. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward and placed his hands together, as if organizing his thoughts before speaking. Then he said something that stayed with me. He told me that in situations like this, people often underestimate the importance of early correction. If boundaries are not set clearly, patterns repeat and grow stronger over time. He continued by saying that he had already taken steps to ensure that certain aspects of my husband's hidden activities were no longer unchecked. He didn't describe it in dramatic terms, but it was clear that actions had already been taken behind the scenes. He called it a form of containment, not punishment. His goal, he explained, was not destruction, but control of escalation. I sat there quietly, absorbing every word. It was difficult to process how quickly everything had moved from a private household conflict to something far more structured and deliberate. My father's tone remained calm throughout, but there was no hesitation in what he was saying. He had already made decisions based on what he had observed, and now he was simply informing me. He then told me that my husband had been given a choice, not in a dramatic or threatening way, but in a clear and direct manner. The choice was simple: either acknowledge the boundaries that had been set and adjust his behavior accordingly, or face the consequences of continuing down the same path. My father didn't describe those consequences in detail, but the way he said it left no room for misunderstanding. I asked him if my husband had responded to that. He nodded slightly and said that there had already been a reaction. It wasn't resistance, not in the way I would expect. It was hesitation, followed by reluctant acceptance of the seriousness of the situation. According to him, my husband understood that this was no longer just a personal disagreement. It had moved into something much more structured and unavoidable. My father then made it clear that this was not about control over my husband's life, but about ensuring stability and preventing further harm. He emphasized that his involvement was limited to setting boundaries, not interfering beyond necessity. But the implication behind his words was clear. The situation had already shifted beyond what I had originally thought it was. I asked him if this meant things would return to normal. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said that normal depends on choices made from this point forward. That answer left me sitting in silence, realizing that nothing was simple anymore, and every action from here would carry weight beyond what I had previously understood. When I returned home after meeting my father, I could immediately sense that something had changed again. The house felt quieter than usual, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that carries tension inside it, like everyone is holding back words they don't want to say yet. My husband was sitting in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. When he saw me, he stood up slowly, as if he had been waiting for this moment, but didn't know how to approach it. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of everything that had happened building between us. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was softer than before, almost careful. He said he wanted to talk. Not argue, not defend himself, just talk. I didn't respond immediately. I simply nodded and sat down, waiting to hear what he had to say. Something in his behavior told me this conversation would be different from all the others we had before. He began by saying that he knew things had gone too far. There was no anger in his tone, no attempt to shift blame or justify his actions. Instead, there was something unfamiliar, uncertainty mixed with regret. He looked at me briefly, then lowered his gaze again, as if he couldn't fully face the situation. It was the first time I had seen him speak without trying to control the direction of the conversation. He admitted that the way he had acted before was wrong, His words were simple, but they felt heavy because they were not followed by excuses. He didn't try to minimize what had happened. Instead, he acknowledged it directly. That alone made the moment feel different. I listened quietly, unsure of how to respond, because part of me was still processing everything that had already taken place in the past few days. Then he mentioned my father. His voice changed slightly when he spoke about him, becoming more cautious. He said that after their conversation, he had started thinking differently about many things. It wasn't just about fear or pressure. It was something deeper, something that made him reflect on his actions and the consequences they carried. He didn't go into details about what was said, but it was clear that the meeting had affected him more than he wanted to admit. He told me that he understood now why boundaries had been set so clearly. At first, he had reacted with pride and resistance, but after some time alone, that changed. He realized that continuing the same behavior would only lead to more problems, not just for him, but for everyone involved. His voice was steady, but there was a clear shift in his attitude. It was no longer defensive. It was reflective. I asked him what exactly had changed in his mind. He paused for a moment before answering. He said that sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see things clearly. He admitted that he had been acting without fully considering the impact of his behavior, not just in moments of anger, but in general patterns that had built up over time. It wasn't easy for him to say this, and I could tell that every word felt deliberate. As he spoke, I noticed that his tone carried something closer to acceptance than resistance. He wasn't trying to win the conversation anymore. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. Instead, he seemed to be trying to explain where his realization had come from. That shift made the atmosphere feel different, less tense, but still serious. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me that he had already started making changes, not because he was forced to, but because he understood that things couldn't continue the way they were. He didn't specify everything, but he mentioned adjusting certain habits and stepping back from situations that created unnecessary conflict. It wasn't dramatic or exaggerated. It was quiet, practical, and cautious. I sat there listening, trying to understand whether this was temporary or something real. There was still a part of me that remained guarded, unsure of how much trust could be rebuilt after everything. But at the same time, I could sense that something in him had shifted. It wasn't complete transformation, but it wasn't denial either. He finally looked at me properly without avoiding eye contact this time. His expression was different, less defensive, more vulnerable. He said that he didn't expect forgiveness immediately, but he hoped there was still a way forward that didn't involve constant distance or tension between us. His words were careful, not demanding anything, just expressing a hope. I didn't respond right away. I needed time to process everything he had said. The conversation felt like a turning point, but not a resolution. It was more like the beginning of something uncertain, where both of us were trying to understand what comes next after everything that had already changed between us. After that conversation with my husband, I couldn't find peace in my thoughts. Even though his tone had changed and he had spoken with a kind of honesty I hadn't seen before, something inside me still felt unsettled. It wasn't easy to forget what had happened, and it wasn't easy to trust that things would suddenly become normal again. The house felt quieter in the following days, but that silence was different now. It wasn't tense in the same way, but it carried uncertainty, like something was still unfolding behind the surface. A few days later, my father contacted me again. This time, his voice was calm but slightly more focused than usual. He asked me to meet him without giving much detail. I didn't question it. I had learned by now that when he spoke like that, there was always something important behind it. When I reached his place, I noticed immediately that his expression was more serious than before. He didn't waste time with small talk or casual questions. He simply asked me to sit down and listen carefully. He told me that after observing the situation further, he had taken time to understand patterns that were not visible at first. He said that people often only see surface behavior, but real issues come from deeper habits and decisions that repeat over time. I listened quietly, trying to understand where he was going with this. His tone was steady, but there was a sense of caution in the way he chose his words. He explained that he had been reviewing certain aspects of my husband's professional and personal activities more closely, not in an intrusive way but through information that had already been available through indirect channels. He didn't go into unnecessary detail, but what he said made it clear that there were inconsistencies in what I had been told and what actually existed. That realization made me uneasy, even before he finished speaking. He paused for a moment, then continued in a more direct tone. He said that some of these inconsistencies were not minor misunderstandings. They pointed toward decisions and actions that created risk not just for my husband, but also for the environment around him. I asked him what kind of risk he meant, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me carefully, as if deciding how much I needed to know at that moment. After a short silence, he said that the goal was not to create fear, but to ensure awareness. He explained that when patterns like this are left unchecked, they tend to grow and affect more areas of life than expected. It wasn't about punishment or confrontation, but about preventing further complications. His words were calm, but they carried a sense of finality that made it clear this wasn't a casual observation. Then he told me something that surprised me. He said that he had already communicated indirectly with certain people who were connected to these matters, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made boundaries clear. He described it as a preventive step, something meant to avoid escalation rather than cause it. I could feel my mind struggling to process what he was saying because it sounded far removed from the simple life I thought we were living. I asked him if my husband knew about this. He nodded slightly and said that he was aware that things were being observed more closely now. He didn't say it in a way that suggested confrontation had taken place, but rather that awareness itself was enough to influence behavior. According to him, people adjust when they realize that their actions are no longer unseen or unconsidered. I sat there quietly, trying to understand how everything had shifted so quickly. What started as a personal conflict inside a house had now expanded into something much broader, something that involved understanding patterns, decisions, and consequences beyond what I could easily grasp. My father didn't seem emotional about it. He treated it like a situation that required structure, not reaction. He then looked at me and said something that stayed with me. He told me that the purpose of everything he had done was not to control my husband, but to create a stable environment where decisions could be made responsibly. He said stability sometimes requires intervention, but not destruction. That distinction was important to him, even if it was difficult for me to fully process at the time. I asked him if things would continue like this indefinitely. He shook his head slightly and said that nothing continues indefinitely. Situations either stabilize or change depending on how people respond to them. He didn't give predictions or promises. He simply stated that outcomes depend on choices made moving forward, not on pressure alone. As I left his place that day, my thoughts felt heavier than before. I wasn't just thinking about my husband anymore, but about everything I had learned in fragments over the past few days. It felt like I was slowly being introduced to a reality that had always existed but was hidden from me until now. In the days after my father's latest conversation with me, life at home started to feel strangely unstable, even though nothing obvious was happening on the surface. My husband continued to act more controlled, more careful with his words and actions, but there was still a distance between us that had not disappeared. It felt like we were both living in the same space while thinking about completely different realities. I kept observing him quietly, trying to understand whether the change in him was real or temporary. One evening, while he was out, I noticed something unusual that caught my attention. It wasn't dramatic at first, just small details that didn't match the version of life I thought we had. A document left open, a notification that quickly disappeared from his phone, and a brief hesitation when I entered the room unexpectedly. These things were not direct proof of anything, but together they created a feeling that something deeper was going on beneath the surface. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I began paying closer attention to patterns rather than isolated moments. I realized he had become more careful, almost overly controlled, especially when it came to financial matters and phone calls. He would step away to take certain calls, or change topics quickly when I asked simple questions. It wasn't open secrecy, but it wasn't openness either. It was something in between that made me uneasy. A few days later, I met my father again because I couldn't ignore what I was noticing. When I told him about these changes, he listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm, but I could see that he was already processing the information in a different way than I was. He asked me to describe everything in detail, even the smallest things that seemed insignificant. I didn't understand at first why those details mattered, but I shared everything anyway. After I finished speaking, he leaned back slightly and stayed quiet for a moment. Then he told me something that changed the way I looked at the situation. He said that sometimes behavior changes are not random, especially when they happen after a moment of external pressure or awareness. He didn't directly accuse my husband of anything specific, but he suggested that certain patterns often appear when people are trying to manage something they don't want fully exposed. I asked him clearly what he meant by that. He didn't answer directly at first. Instead, he explained that he had been continuing to observe the broader situation carefully. According to him, there were financial inconsistencies and unusual patterns in certain activities connected to my husband's recent behavior. He didn't go into technical details, but the way he spoke made it clear that these were not minor issues. He said that some of these patterns suggested that my husband had been involved in decisions that were not fully transparent. He used careful language, avoiding direct accusations, but the implication was clear. There were things happening that I had not been told about. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and confusion because it didn't match the person I was trying to understand at home. My father explained that he was not making emotional judgments. He was only focusing on facts and patterns that could be verified through information that was already indirectly available. He said that, once certain behaviors are noticed, they cannot simply be ignored, because they often connect to larger systems of action and consequence. His tone remained steady, but his words were heavy with meaning. I asked him if my husband was aware that all of this was being looked into. He nodded and said that he had been made aware in a careful and indirect way, not through confrontation, but through awareness. He explained that people behave differently when they realize their actions are no longer completely hidden or unobserved. That awareness alone is often enough to change behavior, even without direct interference. I left that conversation feeling more confused than before. On one hand, I was seeing changes in my husband that suggested he was trying to correct himself. On the other hand, I was being told that there were deeper issues beneath the surface that I had not been aware of. It created a strange conflict inside me, where I could not fully trust either my observations or my assumptions. When I returned home, I looked at my husband differently. Not with anger, but with a kind of cautious uncertainty. He noticed my silence but didn't ask questions. Instead, he remained composed, as if he too understood that things were no longer simple or unchanged between us. The atmosphere in the house felt heavier again, not because of arguments, but because of everything that was now left unspoken between us, and the quiet uncertainty that continued to grow with every passing day. After learning about the inconsistencies my father had mentioned, I thought things would remain in a state of quiet tension for a while. But I was wrong. The changes that followed were not immediate or loud. They were gradual, almost invisible at first. My husband continued his daily routine, but I could sense that something had shifted in the way he carried himself. There was more caution in his actions, more awareness in his decisions, as if he was constantly aware that something was now being observed more closely than before. A few days passed like this, until one evening I noticed a difference that could not be ignored. He came home later than usual, but instead of his usual tired silence, there was a kind of restless energy in him. He didn't explain where he had been, and I didn't ask immediately, but the tension in his behavior was noticeable. He avoided eye contact, moved quickly between rooms, and seemed unusually focused on small things that normally wouldn't matter. Later that night, I received a message from my father asking me to meet him again. I didn't hesitate. By now, I had learned that every meeting with him revealed another layer of this complicated situation. When I arrived, he looked even more serious than before. He didn't ask me how I was or how things were at home. Instead, he immediately began speaking about developments that had taken place since our last conversation. He told me that certain financial movements and external connections related to my husband had started to shift. Some previously active patterns were slowing down, while others were being redirected. The way he explained it was calm, but the meaning behind his words was clear. Something was happening behind the scenes that was affecting my husband's behavior and decisions in real time. I asked him directly what was causing these changes. He paused for a moment before answering. Then he said that once pressure and awareness enter a situation, people naturally begin to adjust their actions. According to him, my husband was now operating in a space where his choices were no longer fully private or unchecked. That awareness alone was enough to create internal pressure, even without direct confrontation. My father explained that he had not taken aggressive action, but rather created conditions where clarity and accountability were unavoidable. He said that when people realize their actions are being observed with understanding rather than ignorance, they begin to rethink their priorities. It wasn't about punishment, but about forcing transparency in a situation that had become unclear. I asked him if this meant my husband was being cornered. He shook his head and said that the goal was not to corner anyone, but to stabilize a situation that had started to move in an unsafe direction. He emphasized that control and awareness were different things. One restricts, while the other simply reveals what already exists. When I returned home later that evening, I noticed my husband sitting alone in the living room. He looked different again, more withdrawn than before. He wasn't on his phone or watching anything. He was just sitting there, staring at the floor as if thinking deeply about something. When he saw me, he quickly straightened up, but the change in his expression was noticeable. For the first time in a while, he didn't try to act normal or casual. Instead, he asked me if I had spoken to my father again. His tone was careful, almost cautious, as if he was trying to measure my response. I nodded slightly, not giving details, and he looked away again. There was a pause before he spoke again, this time more quietly. He said that things outside our home were becoming complicated in ways he hadn't fully expected. He didn't go into detail, but it was clear that he was referring to something beyond our personal issues. His words were vague, but they carried weight. It was the first time he openly acknowledged that there were external pressures affecting his situation. I didn't respond immediately. I simply listened, trying to understand what had changed so suddenly. The confidence he once carried seemed to have faded, replaced by something more cautious and uncertain. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was close to it. Over the next few days, I began noticing more signs that confirmed what my father had mentioned. Phone calls became shorter, meetings were rescheduled, and certain conversations stopped altogether. It felt like parts of his life were being quietly reorganized, not through force, but through invisible pressure that shaped decisions without direct interference. When I mentioned this to my father, he simply said that this was the natural outcome when hidden patterns are brought into awareness. He didn't sound satisfied or proud, just factual. He explained that the goal was never disruption, but alignment with reality, even if that process felt uncomfortable at first. As I reflected on everything, I realized that the situation had moved far beyond what I originally thought it was. What started as a personal conflict inside a home had now expanded into something structured, where every action and reaction carried consequences. I was only beginning to understand. The changes in my husband's life did not stop at quiet tension. Over time, I began noticing that things around him were collapsing in ways he tried hard to hide. At first, it looked like small disruptions, missed calls, canceled meetings, and unusual delays. But soon, those small signs turned into something much larger. The stability he once had started breaking down piece by piece, and I could see it even if he refused to talk about it directly. He became more withdrawn at home. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with constant thinking and silent stress. Sometimes he would sit in one place for long periods without speaking, as if trying to process something that kept growing heavier in his mind. I didn't push him for answers because I could already sense that whatever was happening outside our home was affecting him deeply. Still, I couldn't ignore the shift in his behavior. One evening, he came home later than usual again. But this time, something was clearly different. His face looked exhausted, and there was a visible frustration he couldn't fully control. He didn't greet me the way he used to. Instead, he walked straight into the room and sat down, holding his head for a moment in silence. I knew then that something significant had happened, even before he said a word. After a long pause, he finally spoke. His voice was low and tired, and for the first time, he didn't try to hide the truth. He said that certain parts of his professional and financial situation were no longer stable. Things that had been running smoothly before were now suddenly blocked or restricted. He didn't explain everything in detail, but I could understand enough to realize that the pressure he was facing was increasing. He avoided using clear explanations, but I could sense the frustration in his words. It wasn't just one problem. It was multiple issues appearing at the same time, creating a chain reaction that he couldn't fully control. He said he didn't understand how quickly things had changed, but he knew that the situation was no longer under his influence the way it used to be. When I heard this, I immediately thought of my father. I didn't say anything, but the connection was obvious in my mind. My husband seemed to sense my silence and looked at me briefly before speaking again. He asked if I had spoken to my father recently. His tone wasn't accusing, but it carried uncertainty, as if he already knew the answer but needed confirmation. I told him I had been in contact with my father, but I didn't go into detail. He nodded slowly and leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. There was a long silence between us after that. I could see him trying to process everything internally, trying to make sense of how quickly his situation had changed. The next day, I met my father again. This time, he didn't wait for me to explain everything. He already knew that things were moving forward. He told me that the changes I was witnessing were not sudden events, but the result of gradual adjustments made over time. According to him, when certain behaviors and patterns are no longer ignored, they naturally begin to lose structure. He explained that the purpose of everything that had been happening was not destruction but correction. However, correction, he said, often feels like collapse to the person experiencing it. That statement stayed with me because it perfectly described what I was seeing in my husband's life. From the outside, it looked like everything was falling apart. But from another perspective, it was something being realigned. My father also told me that my husband had started facing consequences in different areas, not as punishment, but as results of exposure and accountability. Certain opportunities had become unavailable, and certain paths had closed. He said this was not about control, but about ensuring that actions no longer remained disconnected from their outcomes. When I returned home, I found my husband sitting in the same place again. But this time, there was something different in his expression. It wasn't just stress or frustration anymore. It looked like realization. He didn't speak immediately when I entered, but after a few moments, he said something that surprised me. He admitted that he could see the pattern now. He said that things were not random, and that every change he was experiencing seemed connected to a larger structure he had not paid attention to before. His voice was quiet, and for the first time, there was no resistance in it. It felt like he was no longer fighting the situation, but slowly beginning to understand it. He told me that he was starting to accept that his actions had consequences he had not fully considered before. It wasn't an apology, but it was close to self-realization. I listened without interrupting because I could tell that this was not easy for him to say. The atmosphere in the house remained tense, but it was no longer chaotic. It felt like everything had entered a phase of unavoidable truth, where denial was no longer possible, and only understanding remained, even if it came through difficult circumstances that were still unfolding around us. The situation at home had already become heavy with silence, but what happened next made it even more emotionally complicated. My husband was no longer the same confident person I once knew. Every day I could see the pressure building inside him, even when he tried to hide it. He still went out, still handled calls, still tried to maintain some sense of normal routine, but the cracks were now impossible to ignore. Something inside his world had shifted permanently, and he knew it. One evening, he came home earlier than expected. I could tell immediately that something was wrong. His movements were slow and his face carried a kind of exhaustion that wasn't just physical. He didn't sit down right away. Instead, he stood near the wall for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. I didn't interrupt him. I waited, because I could feel that this moment was different from all the others. Finally, he spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, almost controlled, but there was a visible strain in it. He said that things outside had become even more complicated. He didn't give full details, but I could understand enough to know that the pressure he was facing had increased again. Certain opportunities were now completely gone, and others were becoming harder to maintain. He said it felt like every direction he tried to move in was slowly closing. I listened without reacting too quickly, but inside I already suspected what was behind all of this. My father's involvement had clearly changed the structure of his environment. My husband seemed to hesitate before continuing, as if unsure whether to speak further. Then, in a lower voice, he said something that surprised me. He said he felt like he was being observed in ways he didn't fully understand, and that every decision he made now seemed to have immediate consequences. There was no anger in his voice anymore, only confusion and frustration mixed together. He looked at me briefly, then away again, as if he was trying to find clarity in something that had become too complex. I didn't respond immediately because I didn't know how to. Part of me wanted to comfort him, but another part knew that this situation was not something simple anymore. After a long pause, he finally sat down. He ran his hand through his hair and admitted something he had been avoiding saying for days. He said he couldn't continue living in this constant pressure. He didn't mean just emotional stress, but the overall situation surrounding him. He said it felt like everything he once controlled was now slowly slipping away from him, and he no longer knew how to stop it. Then came a moment that changed the atmosphere completely. He looked at me directly and said he needed help. Not financial help or practical support, but something more personal. He said he needed me to speak to my father, to somehow ease the situation. His voice wasn't demanding, it was almost pleading. That was the first time I had ever seen him in that position emotionally. I stayed silent for a moment. I could feel the weight of his request, but I also understood what it implied. It wasn't just about asking for help. It was about trying to reverse a process that had already been set in motion. I told him carefully that I couldn't control what my father decided, or how he approached things. My husband nodded slowly, as if he already expected that answer, but still hoped for something different. He then admitted that he had initially underestimated the situation. He said he thought things would settle naturally, but instead they had continued to tighten around him. His tone carried a mix of regret and realization. It wasn't just external pressure anymore. It was internal acceptance that things had reached a point where he could no longer ignore them. The next day, I met my father again. I explained everything my husband had said. My father listened carefully, as always, without interrupting. When I finished, he stayed quiet for a while before responding. Then he said something simple but firm. He said that pressure is not created arbitrarily, but as a response to patterns that need correction. He reminded me that every action carries weight, and that awareness naturally changes outcomes. He also said that my husband was now experiencing the natural result of accumulated decisions, not sudden punishment. According to him, the situation had already moved into a stage where understanding was beginning to replace resistance. That was the purpose of everything so far, to bring clarity, not chaos. When I returned home, my husband was sitting quietly again, but this time, something felt different. He didn't immediately talk about problems or pressure. Instead, he looked at me and said he had been thinking. He said that maybe he had ignored too many signs in the past, and was now seeing things too clearly all at once. His tone was calmer than before, less panicked, more reflective. It felt like something inside him had shifted from resistance toward acceptance, even if it was still difficult for him to fully process. The tension in the house remained, but it was no longer chaotic. It had turned into something more still, more thoughtful, as both of us were now trying to understand what the next step in the situation would truly mean. The tension in our home had slowly shifted from chaos into something quieter, but far more emotionally complex. My husband was no longer reacting with frustration or confusion the way he did before. Instead, he had entered a phase of reflection, where silence often said more than words. I could see that something inside him had changed, not suddenly, but through a gradual acceptance of everything that had been happening around him. He was no longer trying to fight every situation. He was beginning to understand it, even if he didn't fully agree with it. One evening, after a long silence between us, he finally spoke in a different tone. It wasn't defensive or emotional. It was calm, almost resigned, but with a hint of honesty I had not heard before. He said that he had been thinking a lot about his actions, not just recently, but over time. He admitted that he had made decisions without fully considering their impact, not only on himself, but on others around him. Hearing him say that made me pause, because it felt like a real shift in perspective. He didn't ask for forgiveness directly, but he did acknowledge that things could not continue the way they had before. He said he was beginning to see patterns in his own behavior that he had ignored for too long. It wasn't easy for him to say it, and I could tell he was choosing his words carefully. There was no anger in his voice anymore, only a kind of quiet acceptance of reality. I listened without interrupting. Part of me was still guarded, unsure of how much of this change was permanent. But another part of me could sense that something genuine was happening. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. He was simply expressing what he had come to understand after everything that had unfolded in the past days and weeks. Later that night, he brought up my father again. This time, however, his tone was different. There was no fear or frustration in it. Instead, there was acknowledgement. He said that he understood now why certain boundaries had been established so firmly. At first, he had seen it as pressure, but now he saw it as something that forced him to reflect more seriously on his own behavior and decisions. He admitted that the changes in his life, although difficult, had made him realize things he had previously ignored. He said it felt like everything had slowed down enough for him to actually see the consequences of his actions more clearly. That realization, he said, was uncomfortable, but necessary. It wasn't something he enjoyed, but something he understood was important. The next day, I met my father again, because I needed clarity on what was happening emotionally between us. When I explained my husband's change in attitude, my father listened carefully, as he always did. He didn't show surprise or satisfaction. Instead, he remained calm, as if this outcome was something he had already anticipated. He told me that real change is rarely immediate or dramatic. It usually begins with resistance, followed by pressure, and eventually leads to understanding if the person is willing to reflect. He said that what I was witnessing was that transition phase, where resistance begins to fade and awareness starts to take its place. He made it clear that the purpose of everything that had happened was not to break anyone emotionally, but to bring clarity to situations that had become clouded by denial or avoidance. His words were measured and calm, but they carried a strong sense of certainty. He believed that understanding consequences was more important than avoiding discomfort. When I returned home, I noticed that my husband was different again, but in a subtle way. He wasn't restless anymore. He was quieter, but in a more stable sense. He spent more time thinking rather than reacting. There was less urgency in his behavior, less emotional fluctuation. It felt like he was slowly adjusting to a new internal state, where reflection had replaced resistance. That evening, he asked me a question I didn't expect. He asked if I thought it was too late for things to improve between us. His voice was calm, but there was vulnerability in the question. It wasn't about external pressure anymore. It was about us, about what still remained between us after everything that had happened. I didn't answer immediately because I knew it wasn't a simple question. It wasn't about yes or no. It was about time, change, and whether understanding could rebuild something that had been strained. I could see that he wasn't expecting an instant solution. He was simply trying to understand where we stood after everything. For the first time in a long while, our conversation didn't feel like tension or conflict. It felt like two people trying to understand a reality that had changed them both in different ways, and neither of us knew exactly what the next step forward would look like anymore. After days of silence and reflection in our home, I began to notice that the atmosphere had changed once again, but this time it was not tense or chaotic. It felt more controlled, more final in a strange way, as if something that had been building for a long time was now reaching its conclusion. My husband was quieter than ever, but not in a restless or confused way. Instead, there was a kind of acceptance in his behavior that I had not seen before. He moved through the house calmly, as if trying to maintain balance, rather than react to anything around him. One evening, my father contacted me again. His voice was steady, but there was a seriousness in it that immediately caught my attention. He asked me to meet him without delay. I didn't ask questions, because by now I understood that when he spoke like this, something important had already reached its final stage. When I arrived, he was waiting in his usual calm posture, but his expression told me this meeting was different from the previous ones. He didn't waste time on explanations or background discussion. Instead, he said that the situation had reached a point where clarity was necessary for all parties involved. His tone was firm but controlled, and I could sense that this was not about emotion anymore. It was about conclusion. He told me that the adjustments and pressures that had been placed in motion had now achieved their intended purpose. Things had stabilized in the way they were meant to. I asked him what that meant for my husband. He looked at me for a moment before answering. He said that my husband had reached a stage of understanding where resistance was no longer present. According to him, the earlier phases of confusion, pressure, and realization had now settled into acceptance. There was no longer any need for continued external influence because the internal shift had already taken place. He explained that when people are faced with consequences long enough to understand their patterns, they eventually reach a point where they adjust on their own. He said that my husband was now operating from that place of awareness, where decisions are guided more by reflection than by impulse. That, according to him, was the final objective of everything that had happened. I asked him if this meant everything would now return to normal. He shook his head slightly and said that normal would not be the correct word. He explained that situations like these do not return to their original state, but instead evolve into a new structure. That structure is built on understanding rather than ignorance, and once that shift happens, it cannot simply be undone. When I returned home, I found my husband waiting for me. There was something different in his presence, something calm and steady. He asked me to sit down because he wanted to talk. His voice was not uncertain anymore. It was composed, almost final in tone, as if he had already organized everything he wanted to say in his mind before speaking. He began by saying that he understood now how much things had changed over time. He didn't refer to fear or pressure. Instead, he spoke about realization. He said that he had spent a lot of time thinking about his actions, decisions, and the consequences they had created. It was not easy for him to say, but he spoke without hesitation. He told me that he no longer saw the situation as something external being imposed on him, but rather as something that had forced him to see parts of himself more clearly. He admitted that at first he resisted everything, but eventually realized that avoiding consequences was not the same as resolving them. His tone remained steady throughout, but there was a clear emotional depth behind his words. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me that he had already taken steps to correct certain aspects of his life independently, not because he was forced, but because he understood that it was necessary. He mentioned restructuring his priorities, stepping away from certain influences, and focusing on stability rather than control. It was clear that these were not temporary adjustments, but deliberate decisions. As he spoke, I realized that this was no longer the same person who had once reacted with anger or confusion. There was a shift in his mindset that felt more permanent than before. He wasn't asking for validation or approval. He was simply expressing what he had become through everything that had happened. I listened carefully, trying to understand what this meant for us moving forward. The emotional intensity that once defined our conversations was no longer there. Instead, there was a quiet understanding forming between us, one that didn't need constant explanation or justification. That night, there were no further arguments, no emotional breakdowns, and no unresolved tension. Everything felt settled in a way that was difficult to fully describe. It wasn't a return to how things used to be, but something entirely different, shaped by everything that had taken place until that point in time. In the days following that final conversation with my husband, life did not suddenly become perfect or easy. But it did become quieter in a different way. The emotional storms that once filled our home were no longer present. Instead, there was a steady calm, almost unfamiliar at first, like we were both learning how to exist in a new version of our lives. He was more thoughtful in his actions, and I noticed that he no longer reacted impulsively to small things. Everything felt more measured, more deliberate. At the same time, I could sense that this calm was not just emotional. It had a structure to it, something built through everything that had happened before. My father's involvement was no longer actively visible in our daily life, but the impact of it remained in subtle ways. My husband had stopped questioning the external pressure and had started focusing more on internal changes. There was less resistance in him now, and more acceptance of consequences as part of reality. One evening, I decided to sit down with him properly, without distractions. I wanted to understand where he truly stood emotionally after everything. When I brought it up, he didn't hesitate or avoid the conversation. Instead, he looked at me calmly and said that he had been reflecting deeply on everything that had happened. His voice carried a sense of maturity that I hadn't noticed before. He admitted that earlier he used to see situations as isolated events, reacting to them individually without considering the bigger pattern behind them. But now, after everything, he had started seeing connections between actions and outcomes more clearly. He said that this understanding had changed the way he thought about decisions, responsibility, and even relationships. I listened carefully as he spoke, noticing how different his tone was compared to the past. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to justify anything. Instead, there was acknowledgement. He spoke about how certain patterns in his behavior had contributed to unnecessary conflict, not just with me, but within his own life as well. It felt like he was looking at himself from a distance for the first time. Over the next few days, I saw that this change was not temporary. He began making practical adjustments in his routine. He became more organized, more consistent, and more aware of how his actions affected others. Even small things, like how he responded during conversations or handled responsibilities, showed a noticeable difference. It wasn't forced behavior, it felt like a shift in mindset. One afternoon, I received a message from my father asking me to meet him again. When I arrived, he looked calm as always, but there was a sense of closure in his expression. He didn't ask about problems or updates immediately. Instead, he simply observed for a moment before speaking. Then he said that the situation had now naturally reached a stage of stability. He explained that when people go through enough reflection and consequence, they eventually reach a point where external pressure is no longer needed. According to him, my husband had now entered that stage. The awareness he had developed was no longer dependent on outside influence, but had become internalized. That, he said, was the intended outcome all along. I asked him if that meant everything was finally over. He paused for a moment before responding. He said that situations like this do not have a clear ending in the traditional sense. Instead, they transition into new phases where understanding replaces conflict. He explained that what had changed was not just behavior, but perception itself. When I returned home that evening, I noticed my husband sitting quietly, not lost in stress or confusion, but in thought. He looked up when I entered and asked me how my meeting went. His tone was calm, and there was no tension in the question. I told him it was fine, and he nodded without pressing further. Later that night, we spoke again. But this time the conversation was different from anything we had before. It wasn't about arguments, pressure, or external situations. It was about understanding how far we had come and how much we had both changed through the process. He admitted that he no longer felt the same urgency to control situations the way he used to. Instead, he said he was learning to respond rather than react. That simple statement carried more meaning than anything he had said before. It reflected a shift in how he saw life itself, not as something to be controlled at every moment, but something to be understood gradually. As I sat there listening to him, I realized that while nothing could erase what had happened in the past, something new had been built in its place. It wasn't perfect, but it was stable in a way that felt real. Both of us had changed, not through sudden transformation, but through a slow and difficult process that had reshaped how we understood each other and everything around us. After everything that had happened, life slowly settled into a different rhythm. One that felt quieter, but also more emotionally distant. The intensity that once defined our home had faded, but in its place was a kind of stillness that required adjustment. My husband and I were no longer caught in arguments or emotional confusion, but we were also not the same people we had been before. There was understanding between us now. but it was shaped by everything we had gone through, not by how things used to be. Days passed in a calm routine. He continued to focus on his responsibilities with more consistency, and I noticed that he no longer reacted impulsively to stress. He was more controlled in his behavior, more thoughtful in his decisions. It wasn't a sudden change, but a steady one that had developed over time. I could see that he was trying to rebuild his life in a more structured way, step by step, without rushing anything. At the same time, I began to reflect more on my own life. I realized that I had spent a long time reacting to situations instead of understanding them. The events that had unfolded over the past weeks had forced me to see things from a different perspective. I was no longer the same person who had once been caught in confusion and fear. Something inside me had also changed, even if I couldn't fully explain it. One afternoon, I met my father again. It had become less frequent now, but his presence still felt important in understanding the direction things were moving. When I arrived, he was calm as usual, but there was a subtle sense of finality in his expression. He didn't begin with questions or explanations. Instead, he simply asked how things were at home. I told him that things had become stable. Not perfect, but stable. He listened quietly, nodding slightly as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back and said that stability is often the result of understanding, not control. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had taken place before. He explained that when people begin to recognize their own patterns and accept responsibility for them, external pressure naturally becomes less necessary. He also said that what I was experiencing now was the outcome of a process that had already completed its purpose. There was no longer any need for intervention or adjustment. Things had reached a point where individuals were now responding based on awareness rather than influence. That, according to him, was the final stage of any difficult situation, when learning replaces resistance. When I returned home that evening, I found my husband sitting quietly in the living room. He looked more relaxed than before, not in a careless way, but in a grounded way. When he saw me, he smiled slightly and asked about my day. It was a simple question, but it felt different from how conversations used to be. There was no tension behind it, no hidden pressure. Later that night, we sat together for a longer conversation than usual. There was no specific topic we were avoiding or addressing. Instead, we talked about small things, daily thoughts, and reflections about how much had changed over time. He mentioned that he no longer felt the same urgency to control situations or outcomes. Instead, he was beginning to accept that some things take time to settle naturally. I shared similar thoughts with him, telling him that I had also started to see things differently. I realized that many of the fears and reactions I once had were shaped by uncertainty, and now that things had stabilized, my perspective had shifted. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened, but about understanding it in a different way. He nodded as I spoke, and for a moment, there was a quiet understanding between us that didn't need further explanation. It wasn't the same emotional connection we had at the beginning, but it was something more grounded. Something that had been shaped through experience rather than assumption. Over the next few days, I noticed that our interactions continued to become more natural. There was less hesitation, fewer misunderstandings, and more acceptance of each other's space. It felt like we were both slowly learning how to exist in this new version of our relationship without forcing it to become something it wasn't. Even though the past still existed in memory, it no longer dominated every moment. Instead, it had become part of a larger understanding of how things had evolved. I began to realize that not every change has to be dramatic or emotional to be meaningful. Sometimes the most important changes are the ones that bring quiet stability after long periods of uncertainty. In the days that followed, everything in my life settled into a quiet rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and grounding at the same time. There were no more sudden arguments, no emotional breakdowns, and no unpredictable shifts in behavior. Instead, there was stability, but it was a stability shaped by everything that had happened before. My husband and I lived under the same roof, but the way we understood each other had completely transformed. It was no longer based on assumptions or emotions alone, but on awareness and experience. My husband had become more consistent in his actions. He spoke less impulsively and thought more before responding. even in small matters, I could see a clear change in the way he approached situations. He no longer reacted emotionally to everything around him. Instead, he seemed to pause, reflect, and then decide. This change was not something forced or temporary. It felt like a long process of realization that had finally settled into his behavior. At the same time, I also felt a change within myself. The version of me that once reacted with fear, confusion, and uncertainty felt distant now. I had learned to observe more carefully, to understand rather than immediately respond. The experiences I had gone through had shaped my perception of relationships, trust, and personal boundaries in ways I never expected. I was no longer the same person who had been standing in that tense moment at the beginning of everything. One afternoon, I met my father again. It was not a meeting driven by urgency anymore, but more of a natural continuation of everything that had unfolded. When I arrived, he greeted me calmly, as always. There was no tension in his presence, no sense of unresolved matters. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that things had reached a stable point. He asked me how I felt about everything now. I took a moment before answering because it wasn't a simple question. I told him that things felt calmer, but also different. He nodded as if he already understood what I meant. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said that not every ending is loud or dramatic. Some endings come in the form of understanding, where conflict no longer needs to exist because awareness has replaced it. He explained that what had happened in our lives was not about control or punishment, but about clarity. He said that when people are forced to face the consequences of their actions and patterns, they eventually reach a point where they either resist endlessly or accept and change. According to him, my husband had reached that point of acceptance, and I had also gone through my own process of understanding. I listened carefully as he spoke, realizing that everything he had done and observed was not just about the situation itself, but about guiding it towards stability. He wasn't speaking about interference anymore. He was speaking about completion. He said that once understanding becomes internal, external influence is no longer needed. That is when a situation naturally comes to rest. When I returned home that evening, I found my husband sitting quietly. He looked at me and smiled slightly, a calm expression that felt genuine. He asked how my meeting went, and I told him it was fine. We sat together for a while without saying much. There was no tension between us anymore, but there was also no urgency to fill silence with unnecessary words. After some time, he said something that felt important. He told me that he had been thinking a lot about the journey we had been through. He said that earlier he used to believe that control and certainty were the most important things in life, but now he understood that awareness and responsibility mattered more. His voice was steady, and there was no hesitation in it. I told him that I felt the same in many ways. I explained that I had also changed through everything that had happened, even if I had not realized it immediately. We both sat quietly after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed to be understood had already been understood. In the following days, life continued in this stable pattern. We communicated more calmly, made decisions together more thoughtfully, and approached situations with more patience. The intensity that once defined our relationship had faded, but what remained was something more grounded and real. Looking back, I realized that everything we had experienced was not just about conflict or resolution, but about transformation. It had changed the way we saw each other, ourselves, and the meaning of stability. And as time moved forward, it became clear that what had begun as chaos had slowly turned into understanding that would shape everything that came next in our lives. This story reminds us that every action has consequences, and every silence carries meaning. What began as conflict slowly turned into understanding, growth, and transformation. In the end, it is not revenge or power that defines us, but the choices we make when faced with difficult truths. Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most important changes in life.